Many people have been watching the ongoing series, America's First Refugee, and we know, of course, that Harmon Wilfred is America's first refugee. He's been separated from his wife for over 2 years, correct, Harmon?
Yeah, actually, it's coming up 2 years and 8 months, which is just chronic. I mean, it's painful. It really is. As
It
much as
is.
we've remained positive through this whole thing, it's been really difficult because I really love my wife.
Of
And I
course.
really love my husband. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I call him just to hear his voice and pretend that he's lying beside me.
It's so sad for you guys that you've been forced to go through this. And Carolyn, I know I've been asking you this every week. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cause you to grow tired of the question. I can almost anticipate the answer. Has there been any response in the shareholder oppression case against your brothers and the Dare Food family?
Not yet. Keep praying, and I'm shocked. My attorney is shocked that we haven't heard anything yet. So just everybody keep positive, keep
Hmm.
praying, and hopefully this is the week. We always say, "Oh, this is going to be the week," and it's
Right.
not. Hasn't been. So anyhow,
Wow.
we're waiting.
And the attorney hasn't had any back and forth with the court or no indication of what?
No, he says if he bugs the court, then that can cause difficulties. So no.
Got it. Wow. Well, I mean, everyone's waiting to hear what will happen there. It's
That'll be a
certainly,
big one.
anyone's guess what's going on. We know that the Canadian government has done all kinds of things with is it the CRA, the tax authority there in Canada?
Hmm.
So it wouldn't
Yes.
be unprecedented at all for them to be doing things to thwart your progress. But hopefully that goes well, and we'll know more next week. Harmon, you've prepared another just incredible array of information for us today. The episode today, of course, is Wilfred versus the Rothschilds, and certainly there's a lot of conversation on the internet, and always has been, about the Rothschilds controlling the world's banks, the world's money, and here you are presenting us with your firsthand interactions with them with regard to your handling of these monumental banknotes, bearer bonds, all of these elaborate financial instruments that you are an expert in dealing with. What can you tell us about your experience and how you are taking on the Rothschilds now?
Well, this isn't in isolation by any means. The whole it seems that where I began, and that was way back in Colorado, and I've never really uh, thought from my childhood up that I wanted to be a whistleblower. It seems like that's what you get labeled after a while if you're out there telling the truth and bringing to bear people who are doing evil. But it seems that from Colorado through to the U.S. Justice Department, all the way over to Canada, and now into the international. I seem to be following the Clintons, or they're following me, or both in some fashion. And the interesting thing is, I've been following them from the bottom to the top. And what I mean by that is, it started out with the uh, the Colorado issue on my properties there,
Mm.
and it sort of ballooned from there. I mean, I filed that suit against the RTC, which is part of a whistle blown, if you want to call it that. And the RTC situation, of course, was my first sort of touch on the Clintons because they were also involved with the RTC in the Whitewater situation.
Now,
And
remind
then, of
us real
course,
quickly what the RTC was.
the Resolution Trust Corporation, which was a separate corporation that was put together through Congress to take over the failing savings and loans in the loan organizations in the sort of middle to late 80s and early 90s.
Hmm.
Um, and when all that occurred and the savings and loans were beginning to fail because they were giving out loans that were, well, like candy, that were 100% at loan to value and sometimes even more,
Right.
when the market crashed, and the savings and loans began to fail because they were doing all these high risk things.
Hmm.
The FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, had to guarantee those, well, actually guarantee those deposits for all the people that were putting money in those savings and loans. So the FDIC stepped in and decided to create the RTC to
Right.
take over the savings and loans and to literally then take over all of their loans for all the real estate property throughout the country, and then to convert them, well, to package those loans and sell them at pennies on the dollar, so that those who bought them could then go and foreclose on those loans if the of course if the loans weren't being paid, and most of them weren't, and then take over the properties. This was a process that ordinarily you'd think, well, okay, that sounds reasonable, but it wasn't reasonable because they were packaging these loans in $100 million packages. They
Right.
were selling the stuff off for, in some cases, 5, 10 cents on the dollar, and in many cases, like me, where I had one of these properties that was doing reasonably well, I was going to end up getting $1.5 million, $2 million out of the property. Well, the RTC sold the loan for $500,000. It got foreclosed on, and then the buyer, who was a private buyer, went out and got the $1.5 million. So the taxpayer got screwed out of $1 million.
Right. And you
Well,
spoke to
when I
us.
when I yeah,
You had spoken to us previously about how John Suthers was involved in essentially raiding the pension fund of the
that's right.
city. What city was it there in Colorado?
That would have been Colorado Springs, which would have been El
Colorado
Paso
Springs.
County. Yeah.
Right, right. El
So
Paso
He's now
County.
mayor. He's now mayor of Colorado Springs.
Right, and the whole situation with the RTC, it's just remarkably reminiscent of the collateralized debt obligation disaster that occurred, that was the whole 2008 mortgage crisis. It really just seemed like a beta version of that, and the Bushes all made tons of money from that. And Charles Otel, of course, has been talking about the Bush and Clinton Katrina Fund and how these guys are basically all in bed doing these screwy scams. And these are all still the same players who are active and who are possibly keeping you guys separated, and Harmon keeping you stuffed over there in New Zealand. There is something very interesting we learned this week. You just spoke about Whitewater. You know, of course, that the disgraced former FBI director James Comey has he's been on a book tour, and I've got the book around here somewhere. But I didn't know this, maybe other people did. In his own book, James Comey talks about his role in the Whitewater investigation and how
I didn't
he
know that.
feels that might possibly have affected him not ever meeting Hillary Clinton. I found it very strange that he mentions it rather conspicuously in the same sentence as he's talking about he left that investigation because his infant son died in the hospital right after birth from a preventable bacterial infection. And it just I can't help but wonder if that's not a situation. I mean, you've spoken about Gregory Craig warning you that you would never see your children again if you didn't stop investigating these things. So the threats to children, do those then extend to actual actions taken against children? And wouldn't that be the number one way to gain influence over even the most honest man?
Oh
That's
dear
a bad
God
thought.
forbid if that's
That's a dumb
true.
thought. Yeah.
That's a
Pure
horrible thought.
speculation on my part, but there are a lot of elements of evidence there that are
Yeah.
worth examining.
Well, as you mentioned evidence, and I keep on the theme of coincidence or preponderance of evidence, or you say patterns of evidence.
Yes.
This is where I think my story goes from the beginning all the way to the top. And just talking about a moment ago, the RTC scam, I filed a $30 billion lawsuit against on behalf of all the taxpayers of the U.S. Against the RTC and the government for what they were doing and trying to expose the whole thing. Of course, if you don't have the resources and they've got all the attorneys and they've got all the money, eventually it got dismissed, but it was left open because it was considered a civil rights kind of thing. And so if ever we've got the money, we can go back and reopen that suit because it has plenty of evidence and there's plenty of things to do with it. Of course, I then moved on to Colorado Springs and El Paso County to sort of carry on my work down there with the pension fund. And that's when I ran into the embezzlement garbage that was going on in the pension fund, which was an extension of the RTC stuff because the RTC had sold a bunch of properties to the pension fund, and the pension fund group was skimming money off the top. So, went from there to the district attorney's office, went to the FBI. The FBI forced the situation there so that ultimately there was a conviction of the pension fund administrator, And the district attorney who had been covering it up for years ended up getting away with it. And of course, that's the name you mentioned a moment ago. That was John Suthers.
John Suthers, yes.
So after exposing the pension fund scheme and the DA in a cover-up that prompted the conviction of or the conviction of the pension fund administrator and frankly the fining and dismissal of various county officials in 1996. Now we'll get down to some dates. Having made enemies, and I mean I had some real arch enemies then, you can imagine, of the good old boys in Colorado, I moved on as an international real estate and financial intermediary. Now, in June 1996, I was contracted by the CIA as an asset. And this kind of goes with what we've talked about before, but I want to kind of give you a bit of a recap to sort of bring the story into play here with the Rothschilds.
And while you
I
do
was
that,
contracted
Harmon,
by the
I'm sorry to interrupt, but while you do that, I do want to remind people that they can go to harmonwilfred.com
Yes.
and they can follow your story there. They can also just click on the blue letters here underneath this trumpeting angel and get right to your Lumina Diem site. So they can look up all the things that you're talking about, and if they search here for the
Right.
RTC, they'll see all the details, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, the site, as you mentioned in the past, Jason, is big. It's a huge site. It's gargantuan, but it does have an index. You can go through it, and it's very well organized chronologically.
Yes.
So if you wanted to go through and just look at certain titles and certain evidence, you can do that. But yeah, it's there. So you can follow along. But for the moment, let's carry on with the story. What
Yes.
we're going to try to do today, for everyone's sake, is to get through this within an hour. If we don't, we'll have a continuance next week. But in any case, I'll go back. In June of 1996, I was contracted by the CIA as an asset to assist in setting up a private trust system to transact what everyone would know here as the Mitsubishi note. Now, again, without too much of an explanation there, these Mitsubishi notes were released in the late 60s to certain Central American countries, and the CIA got their hands on them and wanted to be able to transact them. They'd never been able to do that privately before. So they came to me and said, "Can you do this? Do you have any contacts that you can do that with?" Now, I say coincidentally, again, we go back to the word coincidence. Simultaneous with that, and coincidentally in April of that year, 1996, I was introduced to what I discovered later was an influential member, here we go, of the Rothschild family, who happened to have a private trust in Liechtenstein. Now, I was told by the CIA that the only way that we could covertly transact one of these Mitsubishi notes was to do it through a private trust. They didn't want to do it through a government. They've been trying to do this for decades with these notes. So I said, well, okay. And then I run into these guys, again, coincidentally, who happen to have a private trust in Liechtenstein. In April of 1996, well, I'll now focus on details surrounding and I'm going to call it the chance introduction to the Rothschild family through a member of the then living in a person from the Rothschild family living in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
But I detect by the way that you're describing it as a coincidence that it's actually possibly not a coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody will sort of pick up on this as we move through it. This is a little bit of tongue in cheek.
Got it.
And in some cases, you don't really see these relationships until well afterwards.
Well, what I have found with Harmon's, I mean, I've been married to him for almost 20 years now, but what I have found with Harmon's story and in connecting with that story and living a lot of it as well is that it's so serendipitous that, I mean, he doesn't purposely do this to, connect the dots. It just happens. It just happens that, the RTC led into John Suthers, led into the pension fund, led into the Clintons, led into, it just happens that way. It's almost like, there's, what do they say? Your life is mapped out, from the time that you're conceived. And it's like, this has been mapped out because now we look back at what has happened. And it's like, holy cow, this is all connected.
And I wonder just how deliberate this could have been, and you'll see what I mean as I carry on. Now this is in April 1996. I was contacted in my capacity as a director of my then company called Arcor International Funding, which was the company that I put together to do international work because I couldn't seem to get any jobs in Colorado at that point in time. And I was contacted at my Colorado Springs office by a local investment broker who, for the purpose of anonymity, we'll call him Bill, because again, I don't want to keep throwing names around here and getting people hurt in any way. After some discussion with Bill, we determined that our common Christian principles, and I at that time I was quite the Christian. Now, am I still today? Christianity doesn't have quite the place in my life today as it had then. At least not as the church is in that regard. But I still believe in God and in Jesus with all my heart. But I find sometimes the church and Christianity can get in the way. I mean, the doctrine.
It's more of a spiritual belief than it is
That's right.
than it is connected to religion.
Well, anyway, back then, Bill and I determined that our common Christian principles, as they apply to business practices, were consistent. And I was out to prove that you could do it right, and you could do it in ways that you didn't have to be a criminal, you didn't have to do wrong things, and you could actually get things done, and you could actually be successful. So, and once we discovered that, we decided to immediately explore joint opportunities in the international banking and investments. Bill, now here we go, was a senior member of an international business trust, of whom the principal trustee was a gentleman named Sergio Emmanuel Arceniegas. A meeting was immediately arranged to introduce me to Mr. Arceniegas. At our first meeting, we shared our common business goals as they related to international banking and finance. Sergio told me that he had significant global family banking contacts and resources that he would bring to bear on proposed joint ventures. He also pointed out that he was a Messianic Jew, or a Christian Jew. You asked me about that once before, Jason.
Yeah.
That means that it's a Jewish person who believes that Jesus is the Messiah. They literally accept the Christian religion from a Jewish perspective and believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, the typical Jewish approach, and especially the Orthodox Jews, are really against that. So it takes quite a lot for a person to be converted.
Now,
this guy was a Messianic Jew.
Let me ask you something. When I Google that person's name, can you see who I'm looking at here on the screen share? Or any of these people? Sergio Manuel Arciniega?
What are you seeing?
Arceniegas. It's got an S on the end.
Arciniegas. Now, there's a number of Sergio Arceniegas. I've actually tried to Google him, and I've tried to find him a number of times, and I've not been able to find him since.
Yes, see, I'm finding that as well.
The only place that you'll see some connections is you'll see him connected to my website, quite frankly.
And there are a number of people that we've encountered in our journey here on Crowdsource the Truth who seem quite skilled and determined to obscure themselves on the internet.
Being elusive, yeah.
What about that one guy, honey? Scroll down a bit, Jason, or scroll up a bit. Go back to where you were. There. Well, no. Go back.
What are you talking about, dear?
Towards the beginning picture.
We'll
yeah, well. The dark-skinned man.
I don't know. Any of these guys look familiar, Harmon?
No. No.
Right. Well, we'll worry about him later. Please carry on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and we will. You'll see how this progresses. He's not quite so mysterious, at least at this point in time. But he pointed out he was a Messianic Jew, and his spiritual beliefs were a cornerstone of all of his business principles and practices. I mean, he was really passionate about it. The following, what I'm about to talk about is from my notes and my best recollections of the subsequent meetings and events that I had, and I'm calling it the Rothschild connection. This is where it starts to get really interesting. As my personal Christian, and I'll call it Pentecostal charismatic belief, my personal belief, and it continues to be, includes the baptism of the Holy Spirit and the operation of the gifts of the Spirit, i.e. praying in tongues, interpretation of tongues, the gifts of knowledge and wisdom and so on. Some people call the gifts of knowledge and wisdom intuition. Some people say that that if you're out there telling people what you shouldn't really be able to know, then it's psychic. But from a Christian perspective, it's called the gifts of the Spirit. Now, during our first meeting at my office, I received. Now, I'm just going to say it. I received a vision. I mean, I was sitting there listening to him, and all of a sudden I saw some things that I just thought, wow, could this be true? So I stopped him.
Well,
And
when you say you
because he
saw a
also
vision,
believed,
Harmon, was it
yes.
literally as if you saw something there in the room?
You know what I mean when I say intuition?
You
You
felt a
sort of all of
very
a sudden you
strong
think, wait a
feeling.
minute, what's that?
Well,
You had a very strong
it
feeling.
can be in your mind. It can be in your mind's eye.
Got
It
it.
can be in your mind's eye. You can get a picture of something in your mind's eye. But I saw this, and it wasn't something that sort of blocked out the room. It was just something that I saw that was just really clear to me.
Okay.
And we call that the gift of knowledge, by the way. All about Sergio and his family that was extraordinary. Now, keep in mind, he hadn't told me anything.
Mm-hmm.
I felt compelled to respectfully interrupt him and promptly share this information in as much detail as I could at that point. I told Sergio and his associates that there were several elders of his family who I saw, uh, who headed a international cartel. That was the only expression I could come up with, that dominated the global banking systems, including the top 25 Western European banks and beyond.
And this is
I mean,
basically
it was a
known by
difficult one for
most
me to
people,
understand.
or at least
What's that?
speculated. This is speculated by many, many people on the internet that the Rothschilds have controlled banking for many years.
But keep in
But
mind, I'm
this
not
was
talking about the
over
Rothschilds. I'm just
20
sitting here
years
looking at
ago.
Sergio, and I'm just telling him what I see.
Okay, sure.
This was over 20 years ago.
Right.
Yeah,
Good point.
and that these people, his family, whoever they were, had significant influence over decisions in the national and international scene. I also saw Sergio as ready to take over the head of this family business as these elders retired.
Well, you have to also remember that Harmon didn't know who Sergio was.
I didn't. That's the first time I'd ever met him.
He just thought he was a businessman.
Yeah. Now, I did notice that when he came in, he had a couple of his lieutenants, so to speak. He had Bill with him and a couple of other guys. These guys were absolutely falling over themselves, waiting on him and almost worshiping him. So all of that looked a little bit odd to me. But anyway, I'm talking to Sergio. When I told Sergio that, he was astounded. He immediately stopped the meeting and asked to speak with me privately. When the others left the room, he told me that not only was my vision accurate, but there was no way I could know this without having such a gift, without being gifted. And as such, any further exchanges were to be strictly confidential with him alone, which made sense. He didn't even want his lieutenants to know all this stuff. Sergio then adjourned the meeting and set up a one-on-one meeting the next day for further disclosures and discussion. He then proceeded to tell me that he had three uncles in their 90s, or at least they were late 80s, early 90s, as I recall, ready to retire, and that he was next in the bloodline of the family to take the head of all the global banking and international corporate interests. He had a file with him, this was at our separate meeting, on his personal history and credentials that told the story of his living in exile in the United States from competing elements of the Rothschild family until recent years. He was probably around, he told me his age then, but I think it was around 35 when I met him in 1996. His formal Jewish name was revealed as Shamuel, or Shamuel, Shmmuel, and that, believe it or not, that's spelled correctly.
I think it's
Emmanuel.
How do you
Shmuel.
pronounce that?
I think Shmuel. Where is that in the document?
Well,
You're almost
that's,
there.
yeah.
Shmuel?
Shmuel, I
Shmuel.
think. That's what
Anyway, he interpreted that as Samuel. Some people
Yep.
called him Samuel
Yep.
in English.
I had an uncle
Emmanuel
who had that name.
Abijah, related by blood to the Rothschilds and a descendant a direct descendant to the Old Testament, and some people call it the Tanakh, other people call it the Torah, King David. Well, all of this was kind of interesting, and because I was the one who sort of brought it up, he had me intrigued by then. Because he had no contact with the Rothschild family or the business until recently, because he was literally in exile and was due to be literally put at the helm, he was seeking a financial assistant and spiritual ally with the same Christian beliefs who could work closely with him as he proceeded with his leadership responsibilities as a Messianic or a Christian Jew. In effect, his Christian belief that Jesus is the Messiah was in direct and marked conflict. I mean, I was astounded with his family's Orthodox Jewish belief. And I knew it at that point in time. This had to put his bloodline inheritance in spiritual conflict with his family.
Well, and it would
What
probably
made
make
matters
him the
worse.
black sheep of the family, I would think.
Oh, in fact, I think he actually used that expression when we were talking. And the reason he'd been in exile is because in the documents that he had newspaper clippings, he had IDs, he had quite a few different things with him that he wanted to prove to me who he was. Okay, his father apparently was also in that position of being the next person to take over the family. But there was a row apparently in the family in his younger years, so he had to leave Europe. They went to Colombia. They stayed there, and when Sergio was a little guy, I think he said he was probably 5, 6, 7 years old, and his sister was around the same age, maybe a little older, and his mom and dad were with him. Apparently, they think it was an assassin. They were run off the road in a mountain area in Colombia, and his father and his sister were killed. His mother and he survived it, and that's when they ran and they went to the U.S., got in, and they've been living in Colorado Springs ever since. So he didn't really have any direct contact with the family until his later years.
Wow.
I mean, it's an astounding story.
Indeed.
But it gets better.
Okay, there's more.
It gets better. I mean, this certainly made for, the way I put it, some interesting challenges ahead. Because he didn't have any banking experience, especially, and somehow he had to be put at the head of all this stuff. But it gets even bigger than that. I mean, bear with me here. It really made it awkward. And so he was really looking for somebody to guide him through this. And forgive me, but here I am, a Gentile, and he's wanting me to go with him and be his direct assistant, because he said, look, no one could possibly know this. I'm choosing you, and I want you to go with me. So I thought, well, this should be interesting. So, and over a period of 3 months, Sergio introduced me to the family banking business by disclosing multiple examples of past international banking transactions in billion-dollar denominations so that I might learn the business in a kind of what he called on-the-job training. Now, the CIA the CIA overlay to this, I call it the CIA overlay, all of a sudden begins to make you scratch your head a bit. By June 1996, I was approached by the CIA, supposedly separate from the Rothschilds opportunity, albeit being under the what I would call the U.S. intelligence. You call it the Five Eyes, I call it the all-seeing eye. You know, I look at the dollar bill, and there's that pyramid with the all-seeing eye. That's what I see. With my top secret security clearance from the military, I've always suspected that this was a primary reason for my recruitment, that somehow they had been watching me, or they'd been and were waiting for an opportunity to approach me about this, because I was
wait a minute. That's important. What is it that you think was the thing that dealt with your recruitment?
Well, keep in mind, I meet Sergio. He introduces himself. He creates this relationship with me. We sit down and do some contracts. And by the way, I have all of this recorded in notebooks and contracts and other documentation. So I'm not just talking out of my rear end here.
Sorry,
I can show you these things, but I'm not going to demonstrate. I'm not going to show you any of this on the phone.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
Sorry. This is all happening in 1996, right? 3 years after the first attempted destruction of the World Trade Center.
No, 1993.
This was 5 years
before. There was a van driven.
Oh, I see. Yeah, the bomb.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. The bomb. Yeah, that's right.
So this is 3 years after that.
So knowing that I had a top secret security clearance, And by the way, I was contacted by one of these guys who ultimately introduced himself and then revealed himself as being a CIA agent, a former Navy SEAL, back in probably, pretty close to the same time, early 1996. And he was looking for some real estate opportunities in the Bahamas, of which I had some people there. So I was doing some real estate deals and trying to get some things done. Then I get introduced to Sergio. And then all of a sudden he comes out of the woodwork and says, look, we want you to transact some deals for us. And in order to do those deals, we just carry on here. As I said, I've always suspected there was a primary reason for my recruitment. Upon my acceptance of the assignment to transact these instruments for the Mitsubishi thing for the CIA, and the first $1 million, or I should say multi-billion-dollar Mitsubishi note under the CIA mandate, I required, coincidence, a private trust to proceed covertly. It was indeed convenient to have what I eventually discovered was a Rothschild private trust at my fingertips, Sergio. So again, July 1996, my CIA handler provided contact information for another private trust, and it was also out of Liechtenstein, to propose the private transacting of the Mitsubishi note. I guess one wasn't good enough. He wanted to make sure that we had a couple available. So upon making contact with that trust through a Miss Marilyn Perry, and I don't mind giving you her name, there's reasons for that, but I won't tell you now. She was the trustee of the Bay State Trust, headquartered in Liechtenstein with an office in Boca Raton, Florida. We discussed the opportunity and agreed that we should meet in Zurich. This was with Marilyn. Zurich, Switzerland, soonest. I mean, as quickly as possible. She saw it and said, wow, this needs to be dealt with. And she wanted to have a closer look. Upon my arrival in Zurich, I received a fax copy of the note at my hotel, and Marilyn and I examined it together. After her sources confirmed the note's initial authenticity, she agreed to proceed. But due to the magnitude, she would seek a partner. And I said to her, well, in order to get a partner to do something like this as covertly as it is, I don't think you're going to know anybody like that. But, here it comes. I then told her of a position that I had with Mr. Arseniegas, and she suggested setting up a meeting with him in Zurich at the earliest. Now, you might wonder about Mr. Arseniegas' bona fides, and even Marilyn's bona fides. Well, at the time, having Michael Lawson in the background as the CIA agent with all sorts of resources to check people out, he was constantly sending me sort of dossiers, if you will, CIA dossiers of different people saying, yeah, that one checks out, yeah, that one is who she says she is, he is who he says he is, and so on. So he was confirming these things for me as I was moving along.
And Michael Austin, he's the Navy SEAL that you've spoken about.
That's right.
So it's interesting because when that person gains your trust and now he can verify other people, that's an interesting technique that we've seen that is used to, gain trust with one person. Now he can slip in all these other not trustworthy people and have them be okayed, so to speak.
Well, I had a number of ways well, anyway, let me carry on. I mean, was it all a scam? Well, you'll see. I contacted Sergio once Marilyn and I decided that was a good idea, and he literally jumped on a plane and arrived in Zurich the next day. I mean, these people were quick.
Hot to trot, you might say.
Yeah, to discuss a joint venture on the project. In August of 1996, a deal was negotiated between the two Liechtenstein trusts to jointly transact the Mitsubishi note, and the process began. Now, keep in mind, this is an overlay to everything I've told you so far, all these other ones. I mean, so there's different layers of this with different people that are involved that also tend to authenticate each other as well. The process began to fully authenticate the bank certificate. Now, here's what we did to authenticate, and it was rather extraordinary. I'd never done anything like this before.
Now you have to remember that these are the Mitsubishi notes.
That's right.
For those who are
fully authenticate the bank certificate. We researched the history of the note, or at least now this is something that Marilyn did through her trust. And she had quite a few contacts in Europe as well as in the US. They researched the history of the note and all the interest coupons. She said to me, in order to do anything with the Federal Reserve, you had to show a history of how the coupons have been used, if any have been cashed, and the entire history of the ownership of the note, who had it, and so on. Otherwise, they wouldn't touch it. So we included a history of the note and all the interest coupons that were transacted. The note was also curated, literally curated by a museum-type curator for date confirmation, and and confirmed with the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. Now, I saw a lot of those documents when I met with Marilyn Perry when I was in Florida in Boca Raton. She wouldn't
Now,
give me any of
what
them.
is the process of curating? What is that process?
Oh, it's a chemical process. They
Good
actually take
question.
a bit and they put some sort of a chemical with it. And I mean, of course, I wasn't involved in that, and I didn't actually see it happen, but I was just told that it indeed did happen.
Hmm.
And then they determine how old it is. Now, usually you do that for stuff that's antiquities, 1,000 years old or 500 years old. I was surprised they would do something like that with something that was done in the 1960s when we were then, approaching the end of the millennium. But anyway, so we also confirmed it with the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland and the Central Bank of Japan. And I was involved in one of those calls. Uh, During this process, it was discovered that some interest coupons, some of them, had been utilized, and I've told you about this before, Jason, in the
Yes.
1970s by then Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North
Very
to
interesting indeed.
covertly fund the Iran-Contra arms deals in Central America. Now, although I personally objected at that point because I thought, wait a minute, I thought this was supposed to be for humanitarian projects out of Central America. Something's wrong here. I personally objected to transacting what I then saw to be significantly tainted notes, and now you can understand why they weren't supposed to be transacted through governments anymore, and why the CIA was having such a hard time getting them done and wanting them to get done through me from a private trust
I'm
covertly.
not sure that I do see that. Why does Oliver North dealing with it have to do with them using private trusts?
Well, whenever you're dealing with banks and whenever you're dealing especially with governments, there's an expression that they use of funds being honest funds without taint,
Clean.
clear and clean funds, as they say,
Free
not
and
having been
clear, is
used
that?
by any criminal. Yeah, yeah, clear and clean funds without any criminal connections.
I see.
And
And
if the
Oliver
bank
North
finds
tearing
that
off the
that
coupons would negate that, basically.
well, and not just tearing them off, but using them for what he used them for. Because there was an actual record of what he used them for
There was
that Maryland's
congressional
people actually dug up.
hearings, of course. He was
Yes,
sat there. I remember as a young kid seeing him on TV talking all about how they used this
that's
money
right.
to buy arms and ship that to the Iranians, and then the money that they got from Iran for the arms was then used to purchase drugs from the Contras who were fighting the
Right.
Sandinistas, and that all flooded back into the United States through Mena, Arkansas, where our good friend
Right.
Bill Clinton was the governor at the
Here we
time.
are. Here we are. Here we are. Everything comes back to the Clintons.
Oh, God.
So when I communicated my objection to the trust, and I said to them, look, I don't think we should go forward with this. The CIA stated that they had long since ceased this activity. This was in the 90s. And the transaction then was permitted to continue by the trust. And even though I still had my reservations, at that time I was in so deep that I was literally ordered by the CIA handler to complete the deal, even under somewhat of a threat.
And I'm sorry to interrupt again, Harmon, but just as I'm looking at this Wikipedia page of Oliver North, I think it's a good moment to remind people that you think about somebody like Oliver North, and I don't know Oliver North. I'm not questioning his integrity or whatever, but when we see his career after he played ball and went
Oh,
along with the criminal operation, he was on CNN. He's got a TV show.
Fox.
He's written books.
Oh, yeah, he's a Fox News contributor. Oh, yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
they stuck in a hole and now stripped your rights and basically put you
Oh,
over
yeah.
there in New Zealand for not playing
That's
ball.
right. That's right.
And Harmon hasn't done anything wrong. He's done everything right. Well, he has done something wrong according to the people who want it to be hidden.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go back to the name of your program and the name of your organization. Crowdsource the truth. It's about telling the truth, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sometimes there are consequences to that. Now I'll drop back a little bit. After the initial meetings in Zurich with Sergio, while we were there, he drove me by car to Liechtenstein. He was so adamant on proving to me that everything he was saying was true, uh, maybe even to the point of being a little bit insecure about it. It was about a 90-minute drive from Zurich to Liechtenstein, and upon our arrival, we entered the Bank of Liechtenstein and were escorted into an elevator to access the secure lower level safety deposit box repository. The elevator had no control panels, and I'd never seen anything like this before, and it literally received his instruction by an internal security camera.
It's also
Once in the
interesting to note
repository,
that when I search
say
for
again?
bank, well, it's also interesting to note that when I search for Bank of Liechtenstein on Google Earth, it's very difficult to find. Does it have an alternate name?
No, no, it's the Bank of Liechtenstein.
And Liechtenstein
Now,
is a country and a city, correct?
yeah, it is. Well, it's essentially a
Very
very
small.
small country,
Right.
very
Huh.
small country, and it's essentially owned and controlled by the Rothschilds.
Right.
Uh, Later on, Sergio made it very clear to me that his family basically owned the Bank of Liechtenstein with a series of trusts. But we ended up getting down in the repository in the safety deposit box area. He produced. Now I'm going to say he produced a personal key. It's been 20 years. I don't remember whether he had a physical key or whether he actually had a key code. I'm not sure. But I can tell you that anytime I'd ever gone into a safety deposit box area, you always had the banker going in with you with a second key. You know, and you both
Yeah.
put the key in and you open it, and then they leave you alone with your safety deposit box. It wasn't the case here. We were down there by ourselves, so there was a lot of trust there, or at least he had a lot of power. He produced this key, whether it was numbers or not, I don't remember, and he opened up a large fortified deposit box, steel deposit box. He then proceeded to show me a stack of multi-billion-dollar bonds that had been transacted by his trust on behalf of specific Eastern European countries. He then told me that these were the first banknotes transacted on that he had transacted through his own capacity on behalf of the family. That it was almost like they gave him some Eastern European stuff to sort of cut his teeth, is the way he was putting it. After that day, Sergio and I commenced a series of meetings in Zurich, and then we moved on to Colorado when we went home upon our return. That was Colorado Springs, where he laid out an extraordinary, I mean, this is amazing. He laid out an extraordinary vision, a future vision of his trust as it related to what I was then informed was the Rothschild global vision. Then I knew it was the Rothschilds.
What
To my
was that
surprise,
Rothschild global vision?
I'm about to tell you.
Okay.
Now, just backing up for a second. To my surprise, Sergio produced copies of 34 additional Mitsubishi notes. Now, if you recall, the CIA had told me there was 34 in total, and that we were going to do the first one, and they had 11 of them already assigned to them. Well, he produced copies of 34 additional, or the entirety of them, Mitsubishi notes, from the same series of the notes of the original one that we were working on, and stated that his family was behind the original release of these debt instruments. And that although they had been tainted by their misuse in the 1970s and thereby prohibited to be transacted further by governments, and he said literally by his family. That's how much power they had. As long as his family provided oversight, the 11 notes assigned to the CIA were released for transaction in the Rothschild's private system. Now, I got a call not long after that by somebody at Langley who said that they had over 300 hours of my phone calls recorded, and that for 30 years they've been trying to transact these notes. Nobody was ever able to do it, and I was the first one who'd ever
Privately.
come, who'd ever come along and had the ability to do that, and
Harmon,
they were amazed.
while you're speaking to us, I'm just Googling around here and I found on LinkedIn someone named Jason Rothschild, who is apparently an entrepreneur and an investor at the Bank of Tokyo, Mitsubishi UFJ. What do you think of that?
As we go through this, you'll see that there's a system that is set up worldwide. Now, people can you can Google some of this stuff. I've even Googled some of it recently just to sort of look at where it is today. But the Rothschilds have a network around the world, and they control literally the banking systems of the world. Back then, I was told that, and I'm not sure how much I believed it, but nowadays, when you see the things that have happened, it becomes a lot more believable. But here we go. Now, as as he began to explain these things to me, as Carolyn knows, and as you probably know now, I took copious notes. I have all those notes in notebooks, and all those notebooks are well locked away. But I took copious notes and created summaries of these meetings with diagrams of the form and the structure laid out by his descriptions of what he saw as his current and future relationship with the Rothschild grand plan. I was amazed that he had all of this in his head with nothing in writing. He was expecting me to literally write it all out and put it all in writing and formalize it. And that's what I did. What Sergio revealed was the deliberate, planned Rothschild, and I'm going to call it destruction and futuristic rebuilding of the entire global economic system that they had already begun at that time.
And this is 20 years ago.
This was 20 years ago. Utilizing the family, international corporate conglomerates, their banking networks, and all their resources. Now, now you asked a moment ago, what is the plan? The following, and I don't have my notebooks with me, and they're so well locked away that I was reluctant to try to get them out to do anything with them at this point in time. So I've done this considerably from memory. Believe me, it's burned in my brain. And when I get the notebooks out, I can prove it. But the following are what I'm about to tell you is key points of the Rothschild global plan. Do I have your attention?
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. The Rothschild corporate and banking interests were in the process of expanding the international money supply exponentially by lodging these multi-billion-dollar banknotes in the top banks and trading on their value under a private reserve system. Now, I could do you a diagram of exactly how that reserve system works, and I was being trained on that because they wanted me to literally be a trader. At least Sergio did. His family, you'll find out later on, had wanted nothing to do with me, but that hadn't come up yet. But Sergio was teaching me this and showing me this, and then I was showing him literally how it worked financially because he didn't understand it. With this system, the value of these bonds could be multiplied up to 10 and sometimes as much as 100 times value to create massive private cash reserves in the economic system. They call that M1, which is the money in the system. The cash reserves created by these, well, let me just back up for a moment. He explained to me, and I did some research on it as well to confirm it. After World War II, these sort of trading programs that were dealt with by using a reserve program were utilized to create money literally to complete the reconstruction after World War II because it was really needed badly. And it was only supposed to be used for that, and then it was to be shut down. But it wasn't shut down. The Rothschilds maintained it for their own personal use and for their own business use. But you still have to be careful. You don't go out multiplying the money supply without creating havoc unless you do it very carefully. So even they had their rules. But if you look at all the different different central banks around the world, they all have a reserve system like this. It's just that they're highly regulated and they can't just go out and produce money in ad infinitum.
And for people who aren't that well versed in finance, a reserve system is essentially, I'm a bank, I have $1,000. You say you want a loan, and I say, well, I'm going to give you a $10,000 loan because I've got 1,000 in reserve. Is that right?
Well, it kind of goes like this. All the money that a bank takes in, they have to hold some of it in cash. And the reserve amount, let's just make it easy and say it's 10%. So if I put $1,000 into the bank, and the bank then has to hold 10% of it in cash. They have to have that much cash available, or they have to be that liquid at all times. And that's the rules of the system. Then they can loan out 90% of it. When they loan out 90% of it, and let's say they loan it to anybody, they loan it to a person who then turns around and in the same banking system, that person borrows it. They then turn around and they put it back in the bank. Well, wait a minute. They put it back in the bank. The bank now has 900. They then turn around and they can lend out 90% of that.
This is fractional reserve banking. That's the method that our whole entire worldwide
Exactly.
banking system is based on.
Exactly.
We've got Sam Wise here in the YouTube comments asking who the Pindar is. I don't know what that means. Is that a real question?
I don't know what that means.
We don't know what
I
that
don't know what
means.
that means.
Sorry, Sam Wise.
But anyway, you can imagine as the money goes in and out, and it gets smaller and smaller, eventually you sort of use up the ability to create any additional M1, any additional cash out of that $1,000, out of the original $1,000. Well, imagine doing that with billions of dollars. Imagine doing that with interest rates that are off the chart because these private deals that they're doing within the Rothschild family can have lower high interest rates. They can have trading times that are, instead of 2 or 5 years, they can have trading times of 6 months. They can turn these things around and multiply the cash. And then what they were doing, if I might carry on, the cash reserve created by these, quote, private banking trading programs were earmarked to buy up en masse all non-perishable, and I'm trying to describe this informally in the best way that I can. There's more formal ways of doing this, but non-perishable, stable global assets, such as gold and precious metals, prime agricultural land, and Sergio was quite intent on telling me that the agricultural land was really important because that's the way the world gets fed, and land never goes away. And even things like artwork, corporate interest in weaponry, critical patents for chemical, biological, and medical breakthroughs, different types of equipment, goods, services, medical supplies, and drugs. Essentially anything and everything that has prolonged and stable value for the human race. Now, number 3, as these assets are acquired, a simultaneous and deliberate destabilization of the world economic system would ensue over time through a constant series of deliberate and orchestrated catastrophes and terror events to prepare the world population to receive the new purported peaceful and safe economic system under the new, what I would call, Rothschild empire. I don't think that's what Sergio called it, but it was pretty clear that's what it was.
So you're saying that they flat out said there was going to be massive, catastrophic terrorist events?
Yes.
And we've seen, of course, this was over 20 years ago, and we've seen it increase dramatically over the past.
And you guys have done a lot of stories, and as you've done these, I've watched them, and believe me, when you say false flag events and so on, I watch and see how these things seem to fit in with this narrative, and I've held on to this narrative this long, and I just felt like I couldn't hold on to it any longer. Since 1996, it is quite apparent, even since then, that in many cases, unexplained catastrophic events have indeed been taking place with increasing frequency, okay, which is what we just said. Number 4, once the global collapse of the economic and banking system is in full swing, and everybody knows that, I mean, how many times have you heard the U.S. is bankrupt? It owes $20 trillion right now. If there was a call on the U.S. for all the money that it owed, the whole system would collapse. But let me carry on. Once the global collapse of the economic full swing, the Rothschild proposal will be presented to the international community as a new and stable system, real global assets, of which, of course, they will have control of, with an accompanying single international currency. Remember the other day I told you that you were talking about currency? I said that's going to come up in the next presentation.
Well, yeah.
Now, they weren't clear on what that currency would be or how they were going to go about it, but because I wasn't in the system all that long to be able to see all this take place.
Would they have anticipated cryptocurrency that long ago? Digital currency?
I don't know. I think cryptocurrency, quite frankly, is a distraction to where the Rothschilds want to go with this. I would guess that they're pretty annoyed by that. Because they wanted to get back to basics. They wanted the currency to actually have some real assets behind it. Now, this is another one that I scratched my head about, but these are the things that Sergio gave me that I have in my notes. All international debt would literally be expunged, and the new system would be based on managing and production of real goods and services without the burden of massive debt instruments anymore. I don't know how you do that, but I do know that this was their goal.
So what effect would that have on the economy and everything? Like, what effect would that have on the world?
It's hard for me to picture that everything collapses and then all of a sudden it's regenerated. It would have, well, it would be
It,
pandemonium for a
yeah,
while, I would
a
guess.
seemingly unpredictable, catastrophic effect.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mad Max, basically, worldwide.
But then is that when they swoop in and say, "We'll fix it"?
That does
Just go
seem
with
to be the
us, we'll
type of
fix it.
thing they like to do: create a
Yeah,
problem
Yeah,
and then be
yeah.
the ones right there with the solution.
that's
But
right.
keeping in mind, this doesn't seem so far-fetched when you consider the position that the Rothschilds have today with the global banking system, and I'll explain that as I go further. The final steps to this transformation, and again, this is my opinion, are the most apocalyptic and shocking of all. Now, you're going to love this. I was informed by Sergio that the Rothschild family are considered, or there are members of the Rothschild family, and Sergio apparently was one of these members. They are considered, even by the Israeli government, the unspoken royal family of the Hebrew race and God's chosen people. Everybody knows that. But they're the royal family. And they've maintained this royalty, this hidden royal family all these years. And he said that was one of the reasons why he had to be hidden away all these years in Colombia, because people who knew about that would constantly try to assassinate these people. And there are people, apparently competing factions, that are trying to eliminate the royal family forever, according to Sergio.
Wow.
Now, as the direct blood descendants of King David, it is, as you probably know this, Jason, being Jewish, it is Jewish prophecy that upon the Israelites return to Jerusalem, and that the Jewish Messiah will eventually appear with the mandate by God to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and restore the Hebrew monarchy upon the throne.
I'll tell you, Harmon,
How
my
familiar you?
knowledge of biblical history and religious facts like that is admittedly limited. So I think there are other people who know more about that than I do, but I can't help but think about the recent move of the Israeli capital to Jerusalem. And of course, we've
Yes.
heard of
Yes,
these prophetic
yes.
things.
Now, the kingdom of Israel is what Sergio talked about, and the royal family will then take their place. Now, this sounds nuts, to rule all the kingdoms and peoples of the earth. Although this sounds almost like a fairy tale, with the financial, now think about this, with the financial power taken by the Rothschild family under their plan of global domination, they truly believe it is not only possible, but their God-given right and mandate. Now, the last thing the Rothschilds would
To
want
rule the
anybody to
world,
know,
you're saying.
yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely, that Israel would finally be the seat of power in the world again. And this is, by the way, part of Jewish prophecy.
But it's,
And I would
let me
challenge,
make
and
sure I
please, I would
understand.
invite anybody out there who's expert at this, who really knows Jewish prophecy, the Torah and the Tanakh and all this, please correct me, add to it, subtract from it, um, fill
Well,
in the
that's
blanks, whatever you want to do. I invite that. I'm not a know-all to be-all with any of this. I'm just telling you what I know and what I have in my notes.
That's what I want to ask, because I mean, this sounds a little more like religious prophecy than geopolitics. Like, this isn't necessarily talking about the 1947 established country of Israel. It's more talking about their biblical vision of Israel. Or is it the same?
It's the same.
It's the
When you think
same.
about Israel and you think about Judaism, it's hard to picture Judaism as a religion, because Judaism is who you are. Judaism is not only uh, it's your identity. I've been told this by other Jewish folks that I've done business with, who were quite passionate about this. Now, I wasn't surprised, terribly surprised, to hear that the Rothschild system in place today is not far from global domination, with family members already assigned. Because Sergio told me that back then, 20 years ago, you call it the G20 today, all the significant countries in the world with central banks were already controlled by the Rothschild family. He said they have family members who are on the boards of the central banks, and of course in the Federal Reserve here in the U.S., or there in the U.S., they're already controlling the banking systems and the money in these countries. He said they can't do anything without getting permission from his family. He was quite clear about that, and he was very proud of that.
Harmon, I'm sure you recall Hillary Clinton was emailing in a rather sycophantic manner Linda Rothschild there in the WikiLeaks that was revealed. I don't know if you've seen those messages.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm about to finish this up, so it looks like
Okay,
we're going to be
sorry.
coming pretty close
Yeah.
to the hour. But
Yeah.
I've a couple of conclusions, and I'm going to ask the audience and you, Jason, to make whatever logical conclusions you want to make out of this. But there are some articles out there that I've looked up in the last few days. Now, these aren't the New York Times and things like that, but folks like that wouldn't report anything like this anyway. But this is illustrated. What I just explained was illustrated in the following in the articles that I have in that. I've linked two articles on page 4 in that summary. Watchdog, dated July 20th, and the other one on January 30th is another one called the Event Chronicle. And both of them are titled pretty close to the same, but they have different information in them. Only 3 countries left without a Rothschild central bank, Rothschild-controlled central bank. Both of these articles were quite clear, and they were loaded with facts and figures and things that you could go out and check out for yourself.
And I think the most interesting
Now,
aspect
as a
of this
Messianic
article, Harmon, is that in the year 2000, there were 7: Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and
Right.
Iran. And of course, we may recall that General Wesley Clark famously gave a speech where he said that right after September 11th, he walked into the Pentagon and saw on someone's desk or was handed a memo that said, I recall each of these countries being on the list with the exception of Cuba, and I think Somalia might have been the 7th listed.
Well, going back to Sergio for a moment, as a Messianic Jew, it was Sergio's strategy to infect this grand Rothschild plan. Because I asked Sergio, as a Christian, you think this is right? You have any idea that the number of people are going to die and the absolute chaos this is going to cause? And he was determined he was going to somehow infect this Rothschild family plan with a Christian bent, is what he called it, cushioning the blow of the planned dramatic global changes with humane ways of executing the step-by-step process. Frankly, I thought he was full of crap. But my advice was to begin this influence on his family without delay. If you can have an influence, oh my God, what can you do? And frankly, I had serious doubts about Sergio's success with these intentions due to at least the following primary family issues at hand. Now, here's where it starts to get serious. As a Messianic Jew, the family appeared to be already considering passing the hereditary baton to Sergio's cousin of a similar age, but with a different life. This person, he said, had a lifetime of banking and investment experience. He wasn't out there exiled, so to speak. Now, similar age, cousin, didn't say who he was, but he did say he was a cousin. And he said that the family was, if he didn't straighten himself up and get out of this Christian crap, that they were going to have to replace him in as much as they didn't want to, because being bloodline was pretty serious stuff. As for inclusion of me as his assistant, non-Jews or Gentiles are not only not tolerated in the family business or in many Jewish circles, especially Orthodox Jewish circles, but they're considered unclean. When I asked where I was to stay, as an example, in Zurich during our business meeting, Sergio told me I would have to remain in a separate hotel, as the family compound, as he called it, which was apparently quite luxurious, disallowed Gentiles. Should they find that I had stayed, upon my leaving, they would burn all sheets, towels, and usable items to completely cleanse the accommodation. Now, in February 1998, and up to February 1998, there was a continuing confusion about Sergio's position in the Clinton CIA Rothschild joint venture effort to form the required covert bank. I mean, it seemed as though this conflict he was having with his family was beginning to infect the joint venture, because if you can think about this, I literally put together the Clintons, the CIA, and the Rothschilds. Sergio was trying to do this as his own from his own personal position in the Rothschilds. But in the end, I can tell you, it looks as though the Rothschilds took it over. They basically booted him out and took it over.
But
And they booted me.
you did that you did that unbeknownst. You didn't do that on purpose. You didn't bring the Clinton, CIA, and Rothschilds together on
Of
purpose.
course, of course. This is just the way it happened, and it's frankly why it worked. Now, I go back to what I said earlier when we started this whole thing. Uh, how much of a coincidence was it? I get connected to the Rothschild. The CIA comes along and says we need a couple of private trusts to do these deals. I then introduce everybody, and everybody goes together and they put the deals together. But then I ask the question: now that the CIA and the Clintons are connected to the Rothschild and they're going global, they're going way above anything that U.S. government can control. Where does that put us? Where does it go from there? I mean,
It's a
in
shocking
fact,
story, Harmon.
yeah, in fact, well, the CIA at that time, and I believe they deliberately did this, they made sure that Sergio was out of play. I remember them contacting me and saying, Sergio's doing some dumb things. We're going to send some agents out. We're going to have him picked up, and we're going to play with him a bit. And so they were taking him down to Florida to show him things. They were keeping him as distracted as possible while they were finishing the deal with the Rothschilds. This was actually happening. Tell you witnesses who were with me when all this stuff was going on. So they kept him out of play and out of touch. They had him initially they had him in Florida, they had him in the Bahamas, and then they ultimately had him in the UK. And by the way, that's where he was picked up. He was picked up in the UK ultimately.
Well, I remember Mike Austin saying, "Oh, we've got him on this place, and we there's a lot of women around, and we're yeah." I remember him saying that on a phone conversation.
We're keeping him distracted.
Yeah.
So all of this stuff, while they kept him out of play while they were completing the deal, and as you know, at the end of this, because of all the stuff that the SEC was involved in, the deal had to be created or completed completely under the radar, and it was declared fraudulent, but privately the CIA completed the deal, and even Gregory Craig confirmed that for us when we went to see him. Once I was arrested and incarcerated in Canada on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, 1998, Sergio had also been picked up in London for his alleged involvement in the Mitsubishi transaction. He had some copies of the note and he had some other documents with him. They picked him up, arrested him. He was then fined $75,000 and he was released. So I'm sure his family were involved in that. When Carolyn wrote to request assistance from him, because he was obviously supposed to be the boss of some of the stuff that I was doing.
And Harmon was in jail, and I was like, "What's going on here? I don't get it. This shouldn't happen. Harmon's children have been taken from him. Sergio, you have to help. You have to get your family to help us."
Well, he declined to help. And
Yeah.
frankly, he just disappeared without further contact. We've not ever been able to.
Maybe he's dead.
Who knows?
We don't know.
We don't know for sure. In March 2000, we have since discovered that Nathaniel Rothschild was about the same age as Sergio, was named executive director in March 2000 of the Liechtenstein Rothschild Investment Trust. Now, there's some information you'll find online right now, and again, you don't know how accurate it can be, but there are some estimates that the Rothschilds and this investment trust is worth over $500 trillion. In 2000, he was named executive director of the Liechtenstein Rothschild Investment Trust. He's been moved around a bit since then. But this was, again, right after all this stuff happened. Sergio was taken out. Boom, this guy comes in. And my question is, was this Sergio's cousin? Was it really? Could it have been? Who usurped his blood heritage? Could it have been?
It could. I mean, stuff like that in royal families, they're killing each other all the time.
Oh,
That's right,
yeah,
that's right.
that's for sure.
Because of what, of course, his family considered a complete lack of good judgment on the part of Sergio, they had to remove him. But then, from what Sergio said, they'd been killing off people in his family for quite a while, which is why he was in exile in the first place. I mean, boy, did I walk into a bad deal.
Hornet's nest.
Yeah, we've not heard from Sergio since 1998, and we have no way of contacting him. And now I say it's time to consider what can or should be done about the new revealed Rothschild global vision of world domination, accompanied by the family-funded CIA. I mean, this is why I call them the benefactor.
Yeah.
They've stepped into this. Now think about the Chinese stuff now. What did I do? I have the Rothschilds are using these old bonds. I'm sure that they didn't have the Chinese bonds at the time because those were being tucked away in a cave. But I give all this information to Gregory Craig. He takes it to the Clintons. They've really got themselves, a plum here if they can get their hands on it. But one way or the other, here we have the benefactor, the ones who can actually make things happen throughout the banking system, connected with the Clintons and connected with the CIA. Where does that take us? Although the CIA, and I've said this, could easily be assigned as the Rothschild International Enforcement Arm, because keep in mind, this isn't the overt CIA. This is the covert CIA. This is the underbelly. This is the shadow government CIA I'm talking about. I mean, what role? If you could say that the CIA are the enforcement arm, what role would the Clintons play in this so-called benevolent dictatorship on behalf of the United States and the global community?
I would say they would fancy themselves the executive branch.
Yeah. And is this why Hillary Clinton is out there, telling the world, hey, I'm okay. This is why I lost, but she seems to be pretty relaxed about it. Wouldn't you think?
Harmon, each week you're bringing us amazing information that people have never heard before. It's stunning, and it has been a disaster for you and your family. But I think we need to commend you on your bravery, and I want to take this moment to remind people that if they aren't following Harmon on Twitter, he's there at Harmon Tweets, and you should be following Harmon. You can also view his work on harmonwilfred.com. He's put all the videos in the America's First Refugee series up there, so it's a convenient way to follow all the different episodes, even when Crowdsource the Truth is subjected to malicious anonymous strikes on YouTube coming from our various channels. And of course, you can get right to his Lumina Diem site. I apologize, Lumina Diem is where the playlist is. HarmonWilfred.com is basically your personal story, right?
I mean, as sort of a final statement here, and this is where I and Carolyn and I come from, and I hope everyone will join us. It's really time to consider what revealed Rothschild global vision. If it's true, and I believe it is, because I think I've seen evidence of it even since 20 years ago it was first given to me, of world domination accompanied by the family-funded CIA Clinton cartel. Although the CIA could easily be assigned, as I said, as an enforcement arm, where does that leave the Clintons? I keep coming up with the same question over and over again.
The Clintons,
what are they doing?
The Clintons.
Do they see themselves now as
I think Charles Ortel would be very interested in this one, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do the Clintons now see themselves as a dominant force, even above, even above Trump?
Well, I think
do they see themselves as a member of the Rothschild group?
I think we see many members of these clandestine organizations rallying and doing all kinds of things with FISA courts and basically violating the rights of anyone who gets in their way. Harmon, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap it up here for this week, and we'll come back next week with more of this amazing information that you keep bringing forward.
I'm kind of done with this one for the moment. We've got some other extensions and things that we can add to this that, again, continues. What we'll keep doing, Jason, is we'll continue to add credibility on top of credibility. Every time, I guarantee you, every time you start thinking, this guy's nuts, this can't be true, this is nothing but a conspiracy theory.
At all, actually.
We'll keep adding credibility to it.
Yeah. And I want to remind everybody that by weekend, I always answer questions that have been on the live chat and comments that are posted on the video as well. So if you want answers to that, you go back to the original interview and you will see that I have posted it.
Well, thank you both for joining me again tonight. We'll see you guys next week. I want to thank everyone for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
You bet. Thanks, Jason.